is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, welcome Sublation Media viewers. We are running on a different platform today. It probably doesn't make any difference to you, but we're using Restream rather than StreamYard today, which means that we're just sort of stumbling around in the background. You might have noticed that the intro was to Diet Soap, but this is the Sublation Magazine show with myself. I'm Douglas Lain, author of Bash Revolution, CEO of Sublation Media. I am the man. And you are?
And I'm Dr. Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent, and I'm the second main woman of Sublation Media. And today we're focusing on an area an area that is close to my heart because it is the main focus of my research and forms the focus of one of the case studies of my new book, Significant Emotions, which I do not have on my shelf to pull up for you at the moment.
Well,
but I was also
point out that after Ashley's done speaking about serious topics within the domain of her expertise, I'll be reading aloud from the National Enquirer to balance it all out today. So that will come up later in the stream. I have some very important news from the National Enquirer. I know. Go ahead, Ashley.
Well, one of the things that really interested me lately was, I've got a YouTube channel. In case you don't know me, I'm at Ashley A. Frawley on all platforms. And I obviously have my own YouTube channel, and I do a weekly podcast called Based AF, where I talk to different guests, but I will also be doing a few more explainer videos as the time comes. And I really want to focus on some of the cultural interest. I don't want to say obsession, but it's certainly on the agenda in a very serious way with mental health. And one thing that I have noticed, as I was saying, when I go on YouTube is how YouTube always suggests to me that I make a video about social anxiety, that it's one of the most searched terms on YouTube. And maybe you can tell me down below or in the chat, what does that mean to you? Have you ever searched for social anxiety before, or why am I so anxious? And I wanted to kind of go into, well, is there really a mental health crisis? And to what extent have mental health problems actually increased? So that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today.
Well, yeah, you sent me a bunch of notes ahead of time. And what I decided I would do is, rather than do my own research and try to complement your own perspective, I would just ask you to go through your notes and to maybe ask some questions along the way. But it seems as though you're questioning the entire premise, first of all, that there is a mental health crisis, and also the political motivations that might be behind this framing of social ills through mental health. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you read the newspapers, as I'm sure people don't, but these days X and our social media, unless you're in Canada, are news aggregators, and it's very, very hard to get away from this notion that there is a mental health crisis. So what did the paper say? Well, I have actually collected a whole bunch of examples here, but that was from last week. I could just pull it up now. People in 20s more likely to be out of work because of poor mental health than those in their early 40s. So that was a report that was released yesterday, which I actually commented on Times Radio in the morning. And this was basically a symptom survey, which is notorious for over-reporting. So what they do is they send out these surveys and you kind of tick off the symptoms, because the argument is that diagnosis is too narrow a criterion to say to sort of accurately represent the prevalence of something. And that may be true. But the difficulty is you can have certain feelings or symptoms in the population. We're encouraged to kind of elide feelings with symptoms now, which I hope maybe we'll come to later. But you can have these things in the population, and there can be overlap with people who are suffering mental disorders. But does that mean that the people who have these symptoms in the population are suffering from a mental disorder? So, for example, if you've just experienced the death of a loved one, this will be the deepest sadness you've ever felt. It is the most human thing. And so this is a symptom that will exist in the population at any given time. Does that mean that these people are suffering from an illness in the same way as someone who's been diagnosed with clinical depression is experiencing an illness? So there's some criticism of the use of symptom surveys along those lines. But generally, symptom surveys will have been criticized for over-reporting. So that was that's just in the news yesterday. But what I found very interesting about this particular report, which was produced by the Resolution Foundation, which claimed that that more and more young people have mental disorders and that this is a cause of their being out of work. What was very interesting about that is that this is something that I have noticed in mental health claims, and that I talk about in my book, is that if you ever taken sort of marketing class, maybe in high school or something like that, or maybe you took it in your first year of university if you went to university, and you'll learn probably about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, right? And it's contested and so on, but it's become this sort of cultural touchstone where first is this sort of assumption that, first you meet your material needs, and then as you move through these kinds of more to less basic needs, then you can reach the higher level needs of like self-actualization. But what our sort of therapeutic culture has done is it's flipped that upside down, where first you have to meet these higher level therapeutic needs and emotional needs before you can meet your material needs, where your sort of inability to regulate your emotions becomes a cause of the inability to reach material things, or meet your material needs. So the solution then becomes, if we just give people more and varied mental health supports, then we will solve these material and economic problems. And what this leaves out, obviously, is a broader structure of the quality of work, the availability of work, a certain amount of unemployment that is built into the system. You know, generally the broader sort of structure of society tends to get left out of that. And certainly it will be the case that some people will be, suffering all sorts of emotional problems and make it very, very difficult for them to get work and stay in work. I don't deny that. But this sort of generalized tendency to medicalize being out of work and a huge range of other social problems, and kind of saying, well, first we have to attend to the realm of emotion. And we see this with like education. So if you have like low educational achievement, or you have lots of dropouts, people will say, well, first we need to make people feel better about themselves, and then we will be able to solve these educational problems. And this goes all the way back to the self-esteem movement. But anyways, this is just one example I just pulled out of the news. So we have another one. Bloomberg: UK mental health crisis threatens to keep young Brits out of the workhouse. Again, out of the workforce, not workhouse. Again, it's the same Resolution Foundation report. And a few of them pulled up from last week. Veteran turned entrepreneur launches Sunderland business to tackle mental health crisis. It's always a business. It seems to be a theme. Britain's private rental sector is sparking a nationwide mental health crisis, survey finds. That's an interesting one. So we can conceptualize the private rental sector and the issues that we have with housing in the UK in a huge range of ways. And it's become powerful to frame it in terms of a mental health crisis, because the language of health is going to connect to a huge range of people, right? Because if you sort of say, well, it's going to hurt poor people, or it's going to hurt this group, you're kind of talking about a very specific group. And the people listening are invited to think, oh, well, I'm not part of that group, so I don't care. But you can talk about a mental health crisis that seems to affect everyone. And so increasingly, a huge range of social problems become framed in the language of health and mental health for that reason. Another one, letter to the Telegraph: a smartphone ban would help tackle Britain's mental health crisis. Here's my favorite one: ghosting is causing a mental health crisis. And this one was from an entrepreneur who promises that her new dating app will not allow ghosting. And I'm sure the mental health crisis will be a thing of the past. So do we have a mental health crisis? It's difficult to tell, actually, because there has been a generalized increase in the use of diagnostic criteria and expansion of those criteria. So the boundaries around what is illness and what is not have gradually become more and more permeable. It's unclear where, you know, normality and illness begin and end. And that's also something that's quite intentional. People will say, like, mental health includes the entire continuum from mental illness to mental health. So like everybody's on this continuum. And especially in English speaking countries, the use of medical language and the sort of how much we sort of educate people in these diagnoses necessarily leads to an increase in people seeking out diagnosis and being sent for diagnosis, getting diagnosis. Now, some of this is good. I mean, it is very difficult if you are suffering terribly to actually, you know, get good mental health care. On the other hand, we have to be wary about the potential for over-medicalization. And I'm not just talking about diagnosis, because what happens with this whole development of mental health as a kind of continuum means that we are sort of invited to think about our feelings more and more as potentially symptoms. And feeling bad becomes a mental health problem potentially. And so I remember I would talk to my students and I was telling them about how depression, for instance, you know, when they first sort of developed the diagnostic criteria for depression, they sent it out to doctors and they're like, okay, you can use this now to diagnose people. And the doctors came back and they were like, well, if we use this, we're going to diagnose people who are grieving as mentally ill, and that can't be right. And they're like, oh, right, okay, no. And by the way, I use this term mentally ill on purpose, and we've moved away from this language, but notice how people wind up saying things like mental health illness and so on, because we are referring to something, but we're supposed to use this whole continuum of mental health. Anyways, so they said, yeah, okay, that's fine. So they developed this thing called the bereavement exclusion, or the grief exception, which basically means that if you have depression, if you meet these criteria, except if you have recently lost a loved one, or if you've lost a loved one. And over time, that exclusion has got smaller and smaller. So, it goes from 6 months, and then it gets smaller, and now it's gone. And, I tell my students this, and I'm like, this is human beings are social creatures. The loss of a loved one is a profound, it's probably the most profound emotion you're ever going to feel. And it is part of the human condition. To say that that's an illness strikes me as odd and really terrible. And my students were like, no. Yes, of course it's normal. And it's an illness. So they were saying they've increasingly they're increasingly accepting of this notion that it is normal to become ill in response to your experience. And that, I think, is something interesting, and I think can have some consequences. Now, I can go into more detail about exactly what disorders have increased, if you like what actually, to what extent has there been a crisis? I'm just sort of asking myself questions. But
I have a couple of thoughts, and I don't want to derail where you're headed or throw you off course, but I have a thought, which is that it seems like there might be two questions around the topic of mental illness. One is, are we overdiagnosing? Are we overtreating? Have we expanded the definition of mental illness too far? And is that some sort of medical malpractice to do so? That's one kind of question. But the other kind of question is, are we attempting to solve social or political or economic problems through the treatment of mental illness inappropriately? And those seem to me like they're two different questions. Like, I could imagine that the psychologists and therapists get together in a little smoke-filled room, but it would probably be filled with marijuana smoke, and plan out a little conspiracy to get more to grow the market for their services, so they can have more customers and have more affluent lives. That would be bad, I guess, but it wouldn't be bad for the left or for left politics. It would just be sort of like other kinds of cons that get out into the world, like the product Goop or snake oil. It's just any kind of con that's run on society where people are trying to make a quick buck and offering treatments that people don't need. And maybe it could even do some harm in some cases, but I have a difficulty imagining that it would do tremendous harm to seek therapy when you don't need it. But do you think that I'm distinguishing between the two potential difficulties with the mental health model and the expansion of the definition of mental illness? Well, or should they be more conflated than I'm imagining they are?
Well, I think it should probably concern people that, like, I don't know how much this surprises people, but there is a general kind of sense, I suppose, or we are invited to think of the process of developing these disorders and their treatments as like sort of people confronting a problem in the world as it is, and then they do some tests in white lab coats. And what says DSM-5 defines a sublation media subscriber as an individual characterized by persistent personality disorder for 6 or more months, interfering with home or work-life balance, anhedonia. Very good. You joke about that, right? But like in the USSR, it was a very common sort of thing to kind of medicalize dissidents and that sort of thing. Anyways, but we should be kind of concerned about a process that is presented to us as simply, scientific and a quest for knowledge and just better treatments and so on, which, it partially is, right? In spite of a lot of the nefarious outcomes, like we do have better treatments for schizophrenia now. We don't have great treatments, definitely not, but we do have better treatments. So the outcomes aren't all bad, but we should kind of be a little bit more skeptical of how this process actually happens and the implications that this can have for how we understand ourselves and how we understand the medicine that is supposed to treat us. So, for example, like, Christopher Lain in his book, Shyness from 2007?
How do you spell Lain there for Christopher Lain?
Lane? Why is it this?
No reason. Go ahead.
In his book on shyness, he goes through like the whole, he even interviews Spitzer and goes through the whole like history of developing these things. And it's interesting that there's a lot of politics that is involved in deciding like what is a disorder or not. And obviously there's there's careerism that goes on. You want to be the one to have your particular disorder named, and if you've got some clout, you can do that. What they tended to do too is when there was disagreement, they just didn't invite the people who disagreed back to the meeting table to kind of talk about what should or should not be included as a disorder, what criteria should or should not be included, what we should call these things, etc. So it's a very, very political process. And of course, most people know about, the exclusion of homosexuality as a mental disorder. Most people know that story, I think, that it was included as a mental disorder, but it was taken out not because someone did some tests and looked at some chemistry and went, whoops. It was the result of a political movement and political pressure that it was eventually taken out. Like a group of gay psychiatrists and so on actually sort of disrupted meetings and this sort of thing. But anyways, with shyness, the criteria were so nebulous that they had to put in a little disclaimer that said, well, this shouldn't be what's now social anxiety disorder. They had to put in a disclaimer that said, don't confuse this with shyness. But it was so difficult to make a distinction that GlaxoSmithKline was able to use that sort of nebulousness, that uncertainty around the criteria. Like, what do you mean by this? Like, what's the difference between having a disorder and being shy? That they spent $93 million in 1 year on advertising. And of course, they didn't advertise their drug that they had to treat this new disorder, this new, well, it wasn't new at the time, but they didn't advertise the drug. They advertised the illness. They advertised the disorder. And they were, they specifically sort of muddied the waters by saying things like, oh, do you have trouble speaking in front of audiences? Do you have trouble speaking to your coworkers? This sort of thing. Are you afraid of saying something stupid? Well, I mean, that's a humongous portion of the population that feels that way. But they would say, well, then you might have this illness, speak to your doctor. And they will send out checklists and invite people to kind of like tick off boxes. And then, well, if you tick off enough of these boxes, then you have this disorder. And so obviously there's an enormous commercial interest in this. And the other side of it too is that it is, and this I think is really scary. And I just gave some public lectures last week. I was doing this little lecture tour. And so some of these videos may be on YouTube. So I apologize if I repeat myself and you see these lectures that I gave last week. But one thing I think people should be really worried about is that it is not very profitable to invest in research, R&D surrounding acute illnesses. Even though acute illnesses can be responsible for an enormous amount of morbidity and mortality, we've kind of forgotten about these things, because we have decent antibiotics. But if we, we're running into antibiotic resistance now, and if we don't develop new classes of antibiotics, we're screwed. Forget about surgeries. Never mind like cosmetic surgeries. It's just a massive domino effect. But pharmaceutical companies are not investing very much in these new antibiotics. Just use one, right? You use them for like 10 days and you're done. Where an enormous amount of the research and development and the advertising and so on and the focus is now and has been for several decades at least. Well, at least a decade or more, is on chronic illness and convincing people that they have new forms of distress that are unbearable. And
I want to interrupt you. Eli says that our link on Patreon is completely broken. And I want to point out, and I don't know how this will work or help anyone at this point, but I saw that comment and I did go in and fix the link. Because I had tried to set it up on StreamYard and on Restream, I put the wrong link in on Patreon originally, or tried to fix it and maybe didn't. It is fixed now. So if you want to go to our Patreon and watch this stream there, you can. That's all. I'm sorry to interrupt, Ashley. Go right ahead.
I'm sorry. If you don't stop me, I will just talk for like several hours.
That's okay. No, that's fine. I just needed to put that in there.
I am still answering this question about like, well, what should we worry about as sort of people who are politically active, who think of themselves as maybe anti-capitalists, whatever, and the conceiving of this in the broadest possible terms. I too am a claims maker. So they've been investing a huge amount in treating these newfound disorders, and often, of course, they will find the drug before they develop the disorder that it's supposed to treat. And so this is a reversal of that kind of, you think, oh, the problem comes up in the world and then we look for the drug. No, they're doing research on all kinds of different drugs. And they're like, how can we use this? And so they develop or they find something that has a medically useful side effect. And then they develop a disease that it's supposed to treat. Viagra is another example of that. And so they kind of they convince people by spending a ton amount of on advertising, but also like they sponsor psychiatrists, they put out these surveys, et cetera, and they're always finding these new epidemics of something that before had been tolerable, but now you're encouraged to believe is intolerable. So you have this new unbearable distress. And another good example of this was pain. So the root of our opioid crisis is this epidemic of pain that pharmaceutical companies uncovered or discovered one day when they had all of these opiates that they were trying to hawk to people. And like the story, like I used to be really resistant to this. Like, I don't like the whole like big pharma kind of critique. I always thought it was lazy. And I'll talk about the cultural side of this in a minute. But the more that I looked into it, the more I was like, Jesus Christ, it's worse than you think. Like, they had like strippers in lab coats hawking this stuff, not hawking, selling this stuff to people. There's like a fine line between like criminal selling drugs and these people. It was just utterly nuts. But they were like, and not even a fine line. Some people actually were charged and sued. But anyway.
So I want to address Shawn Moon briefly here, Ashley, before we continue on. So Shawn Moon says, both Doug and Ashley are parents. It seems they are both incapable of imagining a scenario in which their child is headed for incarceration or early death as a result of involvement with drugs or gangs. And the only option they have is help through the mental health system. It sounds like they want to defund mental health resources. Are they okay with that? So, look, I don't want to defund mental health services. I would wonder if therapy is the best solution for kids who are even dealing with drugs, and certainly with gangs. But I have kids. All of my kids, I think at this point, no, excluding one, has been to a therapist. I mean, after all, I am their father, so they would need that. And I, I, I don't. I'm not saying, and I don't think you're saying, Ashley, that no one should seek mental health
No, and I've
services,
said
correct?
that, yeah, and I think and in my like breathlessness to get out as much as I can. It's easy for me to kind of like gloss over things but knowing that I have also said these things on this channel before. But, there are benefits to medicalization. Like it can be more humane to treat somebody as sick rather than to treat them as deviant or bad. To tell a child that they have, a difference in their brain that makes it harder for them to behave is a lot better than telling them that they're deviant, bad, individuals who need to be punished. So, these frames, they become powerful for a reason, and people want them for a reason. But I see this critique, and also I don't think therapy. If you want to go to therapy, that's fine. I think therapy is like the new age confessional, right? We have part of the reason why therapy has become such a powerful thing, and people have increased their kind of usage of it for less and less severe problems, is because we don't have those connections anymore. We're more and more isolated. My problem is when people specifically try to destroy those connections between people and problematize them. That's what I don't like. And I talk about this in my new book, sorry. But that's often the very first claim that comes up is a kind of descaling. Descaling is from Ivan Illich, his critique of iatrogenesis. But there's this kind of and Christopher Lasch talks about this as well in Culture of Narcissism, where he says like part of how the therapeutic industries expand their domain is by ridiculing existing ways of doing things, existing ways of dealing with problems as backward and unscientific, and I would say further, and problematizing them and setting them up as risky. And this, you can see this directly in a lot of these movements. The first thing that they do, they were like, oh, there's this mental health crisis. And then they do the surveys and they're like, oh, well, okay, maybe there isn't. But the problem is people aren't seeking help. People aren't seeking help in high enough numbers. Seek help. Why aren't you seeking help? Let's break down the stigma of seeking help. Why do people prefer to rely on their friends and family? Okay, maybe sometimes you can do this, but it could be risky. What if your problems are bigger than you thought? So people would say, like, you should bring your problems to a professional, no matter how small they are, because they can spiral out of control. So
I want to address Shawn Moon again, if I can. I'm sorry to, but Shawn Moon says, I would prefer directing a troubled youth to the local chapter of the American Indian Movement or the Black Panthers or the IWW Hall, but those were destroyed by our ruling class. Well, I don't know. Like, this to me speaks to the conflation of mental illness, treatment of mental illness, and politics in a way that I'm pretty uncomfortable with. I wouldn't, if my kid was depressed or getting involved in drugs as a way to remedy some internal psychological or social difficulty, I don't think sending him to attend an AIM meeting or a Black Panthers party meeting would necessarily be a great solution. Certainly wouldn't be great for the Black Panthers or AIM to be called upon to remedy people's personal, social, and psychological problems rather than work on a political project. So
yeah. So
I
part of the Sorry, go ahead.
so anyway, so I don't think that I mean, what are the other options for kids that are having trouble? I mean, one would be to spend more time with their parents and their family. Another would be to get involved. I think getting involved in like a church activity, directing or any kind of community project where they're not focusing on themselves. So that might work for the AIM or Black Panther Party, movement as well. If you're saying, okay, go get involved in something bigger than yourself. But, I'm not sure that what we're looking for here is really, I mean, I think we have this therapeutic model in place so firmly in our mind that we're forgetting that just being social and socially involved is in itself helpful to people without it
Yes.
necessarily addressing their problems directly.
Yeah, and part of the reason why this has become so powerful is because we've lost those. We've lost these kinds of meanings beyond ourselves, purposes beyond ourselves. Even it doesn't have to be like, changing the world. Like, it used to be that once you became an adult, that was like a change in a status. You moved into a higher status. We don't really have that anymore. So the process of becoming an adult is even a loss of status, because our culture valorizes youthfulness and always talks about how children are the future, adults fucked up the world, all this sort of thing. So becoming an adult is often going into a lower status. Becoming a father, becoming a mother, opening up, as they say in Greece, anigo spiti, like you open up a house, and open up a household. This should be was a sort of transition that led to a higher status. No longer. Again, you become potentially complicit in social problems because people love to sort of guilt trip parents for everything. And so we have this, you can't live for a family, you can't live for your community. So this kind of loss of meaning and purpose that leads to a more and more parochial and insular kind of outlook. But what I was saying before is part of the reason why it should bother us as anti-capitalists or as leftists or whatever, is that we are, as I was saying, they've sort of created these, sort of cordon off all these areas of life, and they say, look, this is a new kind of illness, a new kind of stress, a new kind of unbearable pain. And they set it up as an epidemic. There's an epidemic of pain in society, they said, before that was what the opiates were supposed to treat, this epidemic of untreated pain. So it was all kinds of pain that hitherto had been bearable parts of life, that now we have a responsibility, a social responsibility, to offer people treatment. And so now it's not just we're not even having a discussion about the drugs. We have a responsibility, we're told. We have a responsibility to demand it. We have to demand this treatment as part of our social justice efforts. And that's what I think can become very insidious. And I've seen this over and over again. Even when I bring up the example of pain, how they kind of constructed an epidemic of pain. And people say, well, you want people to suffer, you want people to be in pain. So you see, if you then question it, you want people to suffer. And this happens with all sorts of things, like the global mental health movement, for instance. There's a very good book. What's his first name? Ethan Waters, Crazy Like Us, which talks about how Western psychiatry and psychology and so on is sort of diffusing our particular ways of being mad to the entire world. And this sort of medical imperialism, as Derek Summerfield calls it, becomes something that you also have a duty to demand. So now there's an epidemic of undertreatment in the global south, all around the world, and we have a duty to demand that. So now we have a duty to not only to not question what the pharmaceutical companies are doing, but to demand that they expand globally to treat this sort of epidemic of untreated mental illness or mental distress as it sort of gradually expands. So that's the reason why we should be worried about this idea of I think this notion well, isn't it better to do blank than to leave people to deal with whatever capitalist realist thing you want to put there? I see this all the time, and I'm finding this to be extremely worrying, because I put out on my channel, I think my favorite podcast that I've done so far on assisted dying.
Mhm.
And I wrote about it for Compact. And just the more that I read about it, the more I find it to be disturbing, because I was going and doing, as I do literature review, looking at the journal articles and stuff. And people are seriously demanding assisted dying for poverty. They're not just oh, well, the person on the street with a survey. They are making a case the world's not going to get any better anytime soon if, people living in poverty are suffering. To allow them to continue to live in poverty is to allow them to allow a harm to continue in society. They're specifically and literally making that case. And what that person just put up, I'm not sure if that's what you actually wanted to say, but it reminded me of this argument where it's well, look, there are all these problems in the world. Isn't it better to like send people to mental health services. And yeah, I think it is in some ways better to send people to mental health services if that's the only option. But surely we should be demanding something more than drugs and death.
Well, I mean, I think conflating seeking therapy or even psychological or, drugs that treat depression or anxiety or what have you with these death panels that they've got up in Canada is a little bit, it's a quick move, but I do understand what you're saying. Like, obviously.
No, I'm saying it's the same kind of argument where it's like, well, we're not going to solve these problems anytime soon. So isn't it better to do blank, even if blank is, a smokescreen or whatever?
Yeah. Okay. But in the case of assisted suicide, the remedy is really an attack on the people who are poor, right? It's an attack on the poor. The only thing they're not saying is we should help them to die and then we should grind them up and make them into beef patties or something. They're not saying that part, but it's very close, right? So and we could sell the bodies of the poor back as as whoppers to the public, and that's what will feed the poor. We'll feed the poor the poor. And that will solve their problems. They won't be suffering anymore. They're not quite saying that, but it's nonetheless an attack. Whereas if you go in and you say, I've been very sad and depressed, and they say, here's a drug, you'll feel better. That's not quite the same kind of attack, right? And also, if you feel better, maybe you can do better in school, stay out of trouble, get a better job down the line. So there's a promise of social harmony with the treatment of mental illness that is not really there when you push assisted suicide on the population, right? That's I think is a little more clearly.
Yeah, but the point is that death is not a real solution, nor is giving these drugs a real solution. Okay, so I don't think but that's the way that it's sold. It's like, first you have to deal with people's mental block, whatever it might be. And it doesn't have to be drugs. Like, I'm not necessarily saying picking on pharmaceutical companies. There's a whole kind of meaning structure that's underneath this, which is first promote X or do X, which is to fix the individual in some way, intervene in the individual, fix their behaviors, fix their emotions, then Y will follow. Y being some intractable problem. But what that leaves out is that the reason why we're going deeper and deeper into the individual in search of solutions is because our structural solutions have failed. These problems have proven themselves to be extraordinarily resistant to change. There's the quality of the underclass, the quality of life in the underclass is certainly better than it was during the Industrial Revolution or something like that, when you're just dropping dead in factories, but it's still the underclass. And the people who fall into that underclass may be there for some particular reason that has to do with their own psychology. But if it wasn't that reason, give everybody lithium in the drinking supply, which somebody actually suggested once. Let's just make everybody emotionally the same. Now you have new problems in the underclass. Oh gosh, there's something else that's causing these, because in this situation, it was your psychology that caused you to fall down to where you were. In the next situation, all right, we've done away with all mental illness. We've done away with all problematic behaviors, etc. Drugs are a thing of the past, except for the lithium in the water supply. Now you've fallen out for this reason. What is it? Let's give you gene therapy. But there's a structure there that is resistant to change. And that's what I'm saying we're sort of deflecting from. And we've not been able to solve these bigger issues. We've never been able to sort of bridge the gap between our present of unequally realized and unevenly realized freedoms and equalities and so on, to a world in which we are able to realize them. We've never been able to do that. And so what we're kind of stuck with is figuring out how to live with that. Or if we're not accepting our ability to, or we have an inability to live with that, and we're still sort of pissed off and dissatisfied with the way things are, then we have an endless kind of parade of interventions and behavior management techniques that promise to finally solve these problems, or at least make people, as I said, if you're trying to solve the problem, you get an individual intervention. If you've given up on the problem, you get a sense of well-being, supposedly.
I want to. I don't want to stop you from getting to the end of your thought, which I think is complicated and fully worked out in a book, and you're writing articles about it. But I do have something to add because I've been working on a piece about the American Psychoanalytic Association and what's going on there. There has been an attempt to take a social turn within the APSA. And this has led to a couple of different events within the organization. One of them is that the former president of the APSA has resigned last year. It's led to a lot of internal conflicts. There was something called the Holmes Commission report that was put together and drawn up and to investigate discrimination against BIPOC people within the psychoanalytic institutes in America and also the APSA particularly, but not only the APSA. So they sought out systemic racism, or to be more accurate, they presumed or assumed that there was systemic racism and then collected evidence of the detrimental impact or effect that was having on the organization. But what I thought was what I'm trying to wrestle with as I write this piece is how therapy culture, the way in which we have turned to therapeutic solutions in lieu of political organizing and political party, political view of overcoming social problems, has now led to social problems being introduced into the analytic process within psychoanalysis to such a degree that that approach to solving social problems is now destroying therapy. So you're supposed to go into an analytic encounter and keep in mind the agenda to address cultural traumas, is what they're calling them, and help patients overcome their cultural traumas and or the way systemic racism has influenced their psyche. And that can happen in the context of a BIPOC person seeking analysis and being helped through their trauma, or it could be in the context of helping a white patient process their own internalized racism and unconscious racism. This is the new aim, alongside of the old traditional psychoanalytic aims of at least a faction within the APSA. And I'm just struck by how not only is everything individualized when you go through this approach, but also the individual disappears at the same time. You try to solve everything through addressing only individual people, but at the same time, the cultural and the social is introduced and starts to dominate the process. Is what I'm seeing as I do research on this project.
Yeah, absolutely. You see that all the time. Like you see people saying, "Oh, well, pediatricians should also pay attention to the social causes of ill health and work toward ending poverty." Like what? Like what the fuck? But the reason why, so where that came from is from the broader academic, well, it was originally, I suppose, like an academic critique of the individualization of health and later mental health, called the social determinants of health approach. Social determinants of health. And you got to teach this. You teach it to every doctor. You teach it to all the sociology students. You teach it to all the nurses. Social determinants of health, that health is socially determined. And you show them this little like rainbow picture of how our health is caused by these sort of like growing concentric circles from like community all the way out to like the form our government takes. And this was, supposed to be quite progressive in a critique. But what it has done is it has furthered the medicalization of social problems, because the import of everything from your community to your government is how it impacts your health. Like, that's why it matters, is how it impacts your health. So everything becomes important only insofar as it hurts people's health. Now, when it comes to bodily health, there's some reason for that, like lack of housing, or like poor quality housing and mold and that sort of thing. Yeah, that is caused by these concentric circles all the way up to bad government policy, for everything from like the community inability to like get people out of these places, provide housing for people, live together, stay in good families, all the way up to, the state of our economy and, all of that. That makes sense. But when it comes to mental health, it's a little bit trickier, because what it leaves out too is the fact that all of this, the advertising and the awareness campaigns and the tick boxes and the surveys that you get and what you see on social media and what you hear on the news, it is all telling you to think about yourself in a particular way, in a new way, in a very distinct way than has been the case in the past, than is the case in most places all around the world. And that is, you are quite likely to become mentally ill or have mental health problems in response to adversity. Now, the problems might be social, they might be capitalism, they might be whatever, but they make you ill. And you should be on the lookout for that. You should be, and not just generally, you should be on the lookout and think about your feelings all the time. Be on the lookout for symptoms. As a good citizen, you've been taught that. Probably, if you're up to the age of like 45 watching this stream, you were probably taught that throughout your life, that you somehow got the message. You need to think about your feelings, that's quite a progressive thing, that not thinking about your feelings is the old way of doing things. And to be a progressive minded person, you should be thinking about your feelings all the time. You should talk openly about emotions, but also that you should be on the lookout for problematic emotions. And you should seek out if you're truly on the ball, seek out various interventions to bring those problematic emotions onto an acceptable script. And that's where it starts to become a little bit more insidious. So
Yeah, I mean, you become the illness. Social
Mm.
society makes you sick, and therefore you need to seek psychological treatment. But also at the same time, and this is the key part, because society is only the sum of the individuals and their attitudes and emotional responses to things, your bad emotions, your traumatized responses to society perpetuates the illness and therefore needs to be treated. So you're treating society by treating the traumatized subjects, and changing those attitudes within the patients is a way to change society and treat the illness of society.
And this is why so many social justice campaigns and activist movements have given up largely on, big mass movements, and focus a lot on education and like training things and seminars and that sort of thing, because they have this idea that if we could just fix people, because our society is sick and it infects people, well, we're going to go and we're going to give them a treatment. And by sort of treating them somehow, some way, we will then, treat the social body. So by like treating some infected cells, then we like pass the medicine through the whole system. That's the sort of metaphor. And I'm purposely using an organic analogy because my first book on happiness, the happiness movement, I talk about this specifically in the first few chapters of how you had this older kind of social pathology idea of the body as a healthy organism. And if you have a social problem, that's like akin to a cancer or sickness within the healthy body. So you just kind of like cut that off, or like, target it and treat it, then the society is going to be healthy. So that sounds okay. But if you're on the ball, you probably know where that went. Anybody? Where did that go? Society is a healthy organism. We just got to cut off the unhealthy bits.
Well, that sounds good to me. I mean, what could go wrong there?
Eugenics.
Eugenics. Okay.
And of course, like eugenics was powerful on the left as well. Like the Fabian Society, for instance, there were a lot of people who thought that the only way that we would be able to ultimately have like a socialist utopia was via eugenics. So it was a very powerful and common idea. It was considered to be very, very scientific. But, social pathology is one of the very first social theories for, understanding social problems. It wasn't like people didn't call themselves, I am a social pathologist. But they thought about, if you look at like early textbooks on social problems, they use this medical language. They talk about themselves like they're doctors who diagnose some problem and then offer a treatment. So this went really wrong, obviously, with in the 1930s and so on. But out of that, After in the post-war period, the New Left kind of flipped it on its head and had this conceptualization of like a pathological society. Instead of the society being a healthy organism and the sick things being like offshoots from it and like just infecting the social body and we just got to fix them, all of society is sick and it infects the individual. But in both cases, the beginning and end is the individual. And the only way to fix that sick body is to give it some sort of like medicine through these, like, you just target these people at all these little cells and you give them the medicine and then they will be able to sort of like fix the society somehow, some way. So it stops being about the broader kind of processes of society and our structures and our economy. And it becomes this kind of like, there's like how many books written called affluenza? Tons and tons of books called affluenza, where they use these sort of medical metaphors, but instead of using medical metaphors for how the deviant is in some way ill, they talk about society as being ill and infecting us all. And so we got to go into all these places and make everybody like a social doctor to fix people. But at the end of the day, we have very little sense of actually how to fix the society, which functions but in its function, it kind of degrades and erodes, which is not exactly a great organic analogy. I suppose that like it would, if you use an organic analogy, it's going to lead you astray there because you're like, oh, maybe because it's getting old. It's got nothing to do with it, right? But I noticed, like, for instance, there was a comment that just went by like 10 minutes ago that said something like, I often think that in our organizations and in our social movements, if we had better mentoring, we would probably have better outcomes. Like, that's the same kind of idea where it's like, well, our organizations don't really know where they're going and what their outcomes should be. We're very confused. We're very disoriented. We have very little idea of how to overcome a lot of the problems that face us. There's a lot of disagreement. Even the fact that we talk about the left and expect there to be something, that to mean something, tells us about our disorder, the disordered situation in which we are now. Like, if we had a better organization that was going somewhere, we would be able to point to the blank movement, the communist movement, the socialist movement, as like something that has some kind of coherence to it. There isn't that. So we are kind of lost. And there's this sense that like, well, if we could just like go in and kind of fix people, then somehow, some way we would have better outcomes. And it becomes this kind of like, well, I don't know how to deal with that problem, so I will transform it into a problem I can deal with. So, I don't know how to deal with a broader problem of organization, or like where we're going and how to understand the problems of capitalism or whatever, but I can make a mentoring program. Do you know? And you see this with policy, and I hate to pick on that particular person. I apologize. I get what you're trying to say. And I think, yes, mentoring programs would be great, just generally. But in terms of like solving a bigger problem, we often wind up doing that. It's like first promote X and then somehow, some way we will solve some bigger problem we've never been able to deal with. And X is usually like, if we could just fix people. And policymakers are the exact same way. Increasingly, if we talk about unemployment and wicked issues and crisis and so on, they have no idea how to deal with that. They do not know how to deal with stagnation and capitalism. Like when they talk about like, oh, well, maybe economic growth doesn't matter so much. Maybe we should deflect attention from it. It's a false indicator. It's a very powerful idea amongst people who are really rich, very well-to-do. And it's not because they've got their hand on a lever and they can have more growth or less growth. There is stagnation in society and they don't know how to deal with that. And so but they do know how to give you mental health support. And so they're like, well, it makes you feel bad, right? Really, at the end of the day, what matters is how you feel. At the end of the day, the import of any social problem is what's going on in here. So why solve that problem if I can take a shortcut and make you feel okay about it? And so then they'll bang on about, you have a conversation about unemployment or something, and they're like, yeah, and the mental health costs of unemployment are unacceptable. And in this country, we are not funding our mental health services. This is a travesty. And you're like, yeah. And you forgot you were talking about unemployment.
Well, I have a shortcut. This is my segue to how to solve our problems. And it's to do some media analysis. That's what I'll fall back on when I don't know what to do. I've got the National Enquirer. You probably are only vaguely aware of what the National Enquirer is, but it's a fine, fine newspaper. And I'm going to introduce this clip with this.
I feel that I'm simply helping people develop courses of intellectual self-defense.
What did you mean by that? What would such a course be?
It means you have to develop an independent mind and work on it. Now, that's extremely hard to do alone. You know, the beauty of our system is it isolates everybody. Each person is sitting alone in front of the tube. You know, it's very hard to have ideas or thoughts under those circumstances. You can't fight the world alone. Some people can, but it's pretty rare. The way to do it is through organization. So courses of intellectual self-defense will have to be in the context of political and other organization.
All right, so that was actually the old intro for a show we did for a little while, and was not the intro for this, but nonetheless, I think it's important to develop intellectual self-defense against the media, like the National Enquirer. On the other hand, the National Enquirer is for inquiring minds, and here we've got an article in the Enquirer called "Tucker Turns Moscow Mule," and it is commenting on Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Putin. And I just thought I'd read the first paragraph of it, and then we could discuss the degree to which we think that the Enquirer is, you know, putting its finger on something true here, or if we might have some criticisms of their coverage. It says, crafty Tucker Carlson claims he interviewed Russian President Vladimir Putin on the Kremlin kingpin's home turf for the sake of the American people. But critics charge the Fox News rejects the Fox News rejects real goal, because he's a Fox News reject. He got fired by them. Real goal is publicity for his self-named streaming service. So it goes on from there. The conservative loudmouth who's railed against President Joe Biden's support for Ukraine's fight against invading Russian forces says he sat down with Putin because Americans have a right to know all they can about a war they're implicated in. But in reality, what Tucker Carlson was really doing is just trying to promote his new streaming service with a lightning rod interview with Putin in order to put the Tucker Carlson network on the map. So what do you think? You think that that's accurate? I mean, not only am I analyzing the media, but then again, so is the National Enquirer. And if that's not enough for you, I could also tell you about some divorces from celebrities as well, if that. So what? All right.
Well, you tell me, what do you think about that? Why did you feel like that was?
Well, because it's interesting to read. Well, first of all, you know, I thought maybe this was written by some people on Twitter, because it seems to be the common critique of anyone who dares to say things or do things that is dissonant or out of step, that they're grifters, right? So Tucker Carlson is being called a grifter here by the Enquirer. But what's also interesting is that the Enquirer has, I think, the demographic that reads the Enquirer. Well, I mean, look, we've got some advertisements here for a wonderful wheelchair that you can get. This is for the over 70 set. This magazine, this newspaper. You know, these are people who still read paper. So it's interesting to me that the National Enquirer is so woke, and yet, you know, it's totally a boomer publication.
Okay, well, at least if you buy the National Enquirer, do you think it'll make you as anxious as if you spend a little bit of time on TikTok or?
No, I don't. I find it soothing and comforting to read the Enquirer. I do not find it makes me anxious to read.
Okay. Well, I wanted to talk. So let's talk more about the Enquirer in the Parrot Room. And I also wanted to talk about something that I only touched on briefly at the beginning, which was about where has there been a mental health? Where is there actually a mental health crisis? Well, there actually has been a rise in depression and social anxiety in particular countries among particular groups. Things that I find very depressing, yes, yeah. But interesting from a sociological perspective. So why are you so anxious? Let's find out in the Patreon.
And let's use this for our outro. I'm not sure what it is, but there it is. Here it is.